Smyrna Museum of History's first ever virtual museum program. My name's Greg Holbrook. I am the museum director at the New Smyrna Museum of History when it's open. And today I am the director of my own cluttered craft room here at my house, where I'm joining you along with Emily Jane Murray from the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Just a quick update on stuff at the museum. We're doing a little maintenance work at the museum nowadays, but that's really all we have going on. Our board of directors continues to monitor, on a day-by-day and week-by-week basis, the best information that we're getting from health experts. And of course, we're looking forward to getting some in-person programs back on the schedule and inviting people back into the museum. And as soon as we feel like it's safe to invite our volunteers back, to welcome you all back to the museum, we'll be putting an announcement out through our newsletter and through our Facebook page to let people know when the museum's going to be reopening for that time period. And we'll also, between now and then, be sharing with you a video copy of this presentation, as well as other programming that we're going to be putting together and releasing to our Facebook page for you to interact with while the museum's actually not open to the public. But right now, we're here for Archaeology Works, and we're excited about Archaeology Works. We're going into our second year of providing this programming through the museum. It's always great to have Emily Jane out. I'm going to introduce her right now. Emily Jane Murray actually earned her master's degree in anthropology from Brandeis University and holds a bachelor's in communication from Flagler College. She lives up in St. Augustine. She's worked on site excavation throughout the Southeast United States and created numerous outreach tools and exhibits for museums. She currently works as a public archaeology coordinator for the Northeast region of the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Her interests include Florida prehistoric archaeology, historic cemeteries, and public archaeology and interpretation. Please join me in welcoming Emily Jane Murray.
Yeah, thanks to the museum for putting all this together, and thanks to everybody for joining in. We couldn't do it without you. It would just be Greg and I talking to ourselves, right? So glad everybody was able to join us and log on. Today we're going to talk a little bit about animal remains. So this is part of a series that we do through the Florida Public Archaeology Network called Archaeology Works. I know many of you have probably been to lectures or read books or seen, documentaries where archaeologists tell you all of this cool stuff they found. And I even often walk away going, well, how did they figure that out? So Archaeology Works is really meant to kind of get behind the science of archaeology and really look at some of the materials that we study and how we study them and what we really are able to learn from some of those things. So today we're going to feature animal remains. So my stump speech, I work with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. We are a statewide not-for-profit that works to protect and promote Florida's buried past. We do this through three main work areas, mostly doing outreach and education, but we also assist local governments and assist the State Division of Historic Resources with any projects or management or anything that we can do with those entities. We do have 8 regional offices across the state. So the organization was founded with this idea that you could pick up a phone and call a local archaeologist who knows about the resources that are there in your backyard, who can give you more information or provide programming or even just take a look at something you may have found. So today's topic is animal remains, but the archaeologists who study animal remains are all called zoo archaeologists. So this is the study of animals to the remains that we find at the sites. And what we're really trying to figure out is past human interaction. So sometimes this is, what did people eat for dinner? Sometimes this is animal domestication. What kind of pets did they have? What kind of animals were they breeding? Or it could be, what were they hunting? What were they fishing? What animals were important to past cultures? What animals were not important to past cultures? Things like that. So really thinking about, animal and interaction between people and animals. So does anybody want to take a guess? You can type it in the chat box if you have any ideas of where an archaeologist might find animal remains. What kind of sites or what part of sites might we look at for these? Oh, historic travel routes. That's a good one. Maybe if something happened along the way, you had to get rid of a horse, or maybe you had lunch and you threw your trash out the side of the wagon. Near historic human dwellings, near our houses, absolutely. Sometimes even inside of houses, right? I have animals inside my house right now, so. Trash. Trash is something all archaeologists love. We find all sorts of goodies in trash, and in fact, that is a couple of the types of sites I'm going to highlight. The first one is pre-contact middens. So a shell midden is essentially a trash pile that is made by Native Americans, that was left behind by Native Americans. And so a lot of the trash that we find here in Florida is made out of shells. So both marine shells, things like oysters and quahog clams, but we also find them huge piles of freshwater shells as well. So some of those little tiny snail shells that we find in the St. Johns River. We find, if anyone's been to Pontoon Island, there's a huge mound that's made out of just those little tiny, just thousands and thousands of those little snail shells. So these are really cool. As I say, it's trash piles, and they maybe sometimes would use the trash to build things like big mounds, or if we go down south to Fort Myers, the Calusa would use the material to build ramps and ditches and all sorts of crazy things. But the material itself is made up of, as I say, shells, but also things like broken tools, broken pottery, and then lots of other types of faunal remains. And so the animal remains here could be leftovers from dinner, but they could also be things like broken tools, or even just tools, things that people dropped and lost or forgot about. So in the example on the slide here, you'll see the second image down on the far right is of shark's teeth, and the top two have holes drilled in them. So these might have been either attached to a stick to use as a cutting tool, or maybe they were made into necklaces. People still wear shark's tooth necklaces today, right? And then the next photo down is actually an example of a billet. So this is a hammer that was made out of a deer antler. So these can be tools as well. One thing to think about when you're looking at the Native American sites is all the animals we're going to find are going to be animals that lived here in Florida before the Europeans arrived. So we're going to find, deer and fish and alligator and birds and turtles, things that are here and that are native to Florida. But when the Europeans arrive, we'll see things change. How they handle trash changes, the types of things they throw away change, the types of things they use change. So we actually see, one of the big changes we see is the addition of different types of animals. So animals, domesticated animals like cows and pigs, and chickens, all those kinds of things. And we do see that Europeans, especially in St. Augustine, start to use the natural resources as well, the native resources here. So we do find things like oyster shells and deer, and those things continue on in some of these places. But so the native folks, as I say, a lot of times they might just have piled their trash up. A lot of the historic sites we find, people were trying to bury their trash. And if you think about it, before we had a garbage truck that would drive around our house to all of our houses and pick up our garbage every week and take it to a dump, which is basically a giant modern bin, right? A big pile of trash. People would get creative with how to get rid of trash. So a lot of times we find that they were burying it in their backyard, or they were throwing it into holes that maybe were used for something else that they don't need anymore. So like an abandoned well. It's a big hole in the ground. If you need to fill it in, why not just get rid of all of your trash at the same time and dump it in there? So we find lots of trash in wells, old latrines or privies, right? Bathrooms that were essentially holes in the ground. When you were done with those, you can fill them in. And so once again, just we can learn a lot about what people were doing, what people were eating, and the types of materials they had. And sometimes we find some pretty interesting and kind of even seemingly more special sites. Sometimes we find actual burials of whole animals. And if we think about practices today, once again, if we have a beloved pet that dies, right, we're going to bury them in the backyard. And so archaeologists in downtown St. Augustine have found a lot of pet burials when they've been doing their work, some from hundreds of years ago, some from not as long ago. These are two examples of some really interesting burials. The top left is the disarticulated donkey. And he was found over on Anastasia Island, kind of near the alligator farm in the Anastasia State Park, which was the old Spanish quarry. And this is where they, the Spanish would go and quarry coquina blocks for use in construction. They would, they actually had native folks who were indentured servants and slaves who would work the quarries. You would cut the stone, you'd have to let them dry out for a little while, and then they would kind of put them on rafts and drag them across the inlet to get to downtown St. Augustine. And so this donkey was found buried near where they think some of the workers were living, and he was disarticulated. So this is a word with a specific meaning. Right now, I am articulated. All of my bones are attached and assembled as they should be. So to be disarticulated would be to have been taken apart, and not butchered, not cut apart, but actually to have been taken apart at kind of natural joints. So essentially the donkey had his legs removed, but at kind of the natural joints. And so there's lots of really fun ideas about what happened to this donkey. It's believed he was probably used, you know, at the quarries, and so maybe he was important and people, you know, beloved to some of these workers, so they gave him a burial. As I mentioned, it was associated with a Native American kind of village site, living, you know, occupation site. So maybe they buried him, and he's kind of bundled together. That's reminiscent of older methods of interments that we find in Native American graves. I also like to sometimes think, you know, Occam's razor. So what's the simplest explanation? I have never personally had to bury a donkey. I don't know if anyone else on the call has, but donkeys are pretty big. So I'm thinking maybe if you pulled the legs off, you could dig a smaller hole. And so maybe they just kind of took them apart so that they could make it a little easy to bury the donkey. So who knows? Fun things to think about and talk about. The second image is actually of a marsh tacky. So this is a type of small horse that the Spanish brought with them when they first came over. And the dragoons used them, the Spanish military used them. And he was actually found downtown underneath a restaurant that is right near the property where the dragoons barracks were. So this was probably a military horse that was given a burial when he passed. So some interesting sites. So what do you think we can learn about people from these animal bones? What kind of questions do you think archaeologists are asking, or what kind of answers do you think we're getting? What they ate, diet, yes, all sorts of good information. What animals might have been domesticated? That's an interesting line of inquiry. Oh, how healthy the animals were that they were eating, and if they were domesticated. That's an interesting one. I've been reading a little bit about Jamestown lately, and Valley Forge, and some of these sites where people were starving, and so they ate whatever they could find. And I can imagine that the animals they were eating probably were not very healthy either. Animals that were alive at the same time as humans, yeah, that's an interesting one. Some of the pre-contact middens that we have found in Jacksonville, we found evidence of animals that are now extinct. So things like passenger pigeon, that we know used to live here in Florida but are no longer around. And also they found great auk bones at a site, and that's an Arctic bird. So it's kind of interesting to think of what how the bird got down here. Why was the bird down here? How do you explain that one? So, and if they used animals for work, that's a good one. If animals came from outside of Florida, yeah, we have armadillos here in Florida now, but it's thought that they just kind of wandered over from Texas. So How did some of the animals get here? Did they wander over? Did people bring them? Good questions, good thoughts. So when archaeologists first approach, we call it a faunal assemblage. So the animal remains that we find at a site, they may be in these just big piles of bones. We don't often find full intact bones like we did with our burials there. A lot of times we find broken little fragments of them. And so this first step is to separate those from all the other materials we may have at a site. And the next step is to try to figure out what kind of animals they are, right? Trying to separate them even into broad categories of you know, mammals or birds or reptiles, and to start to go from there. And what we're trying to do with that is trying to figure out the number of identified specimens. So this is the total number, the type of animals that we can find. And some animals we can figure out pretty, you know, identifying them pretty close down to genus and species, so we can figure out, you know, if it's a deer, we can tell it's a deer. Some things like fish and turtles, we may only be able to figure out, well, it's some kind of pond turtle, right? It's some kind of slider. We may not get down to the exact genus and species. But just trying to figure out what kinds of animals we have and how many we have. The other thing that we do is a minimum number of individuals. So if we know we have deer, do we have 1 deer or do we have 12 deer? Right? And so if we have 6 deer skulls, that's a pretty good sign that we may have at least 6 deer, because each deer probably, I mean, there could be some crazy genetic flukes, but generally each deer is only going to have 1 skull, right? So we can do that by looking at the individual elements we have and trying to figure out how, 1 skull, 2 arm bones, things like that, and trying to figure out how many animals we have. And that can help us play into figuring out things like dietary contribution, right? So they've come up with mathematical formulas that will tell you, you know, if you have an average size deer, you're going to get X amount of pounds of meat. If you have an average size cow, you're going to get X amount of pounds of meat. If you have an average size fish, you're going to get so much meat from that. And that can let us know, you know, how many people could have been fed from these assemblages. And really, you know, you may have mostly fish bones, but when you start to look at how much meat you're getting out of that, you'll figure out, oh, well, they were still getting more meat from the cows than they were, even though they had tons more fish, because the cows have more to offer. So that can start telling us about what kinds of things they were eating and how much of it. Other things that we think about is also choice, right? Diet isn't just what can you eat, it's what do you want to eat. And so we'll see plenty of instances where there's tons of edible food around, but people, you know, choose not to eat that, or it's socially taboo, or it's just not acceptable, or doesn't, you know, present the right face to the world, right? They want the choice meats to show that they've made it in high class society or something like that, right? So we can think about the type of cuts that we have. And you can see a lot of this through the bones that we may have left over. You know, a rib bone is going to be different from something from, you know, a different type of cut of meat. So looking at that, and also thinking a little bit about how the animal was processed. So I mentioned we have disarticulating and we have butchering. So disarticulating is much more common in pre-contact sites. Native peoples didn't really have metal tools that could cut through bone. And so a lot of times they would just kind of pull the animals apart. Or we see crack, you know, they maybe cracked bones open versus getting a nice clean cut through them. And then we can see, you know, the different types of butchering that comes in, especially through European times, and how they were disassembling and butchering and chopping and cutting and splitting and all sorts of things like that. And when we look at that, we can also tell, you know, maybe if people were hungrier at times than others. So if we see only butchered bones with, you know, maybe they were doing well, but if you start to see that they are cracking bones open and trying to get to the bone marrow that's inside of that, that can sometimes be evidence that people are trying to find whatever bit of meat and nutrition from the animals that they may have to offer. So this is just an example of some of those butchering cuts that we may find. So these are, from metal tools where they've been cutting the meat and the tendons and all off of the bone. So that's something we would look at to make note if we find those. So animals can tell us, about specific people and specific households and communities, but we can also ask some pretty big questions. And we can study things like the Columbian Exchange, right? We see during the colonial period this huge flux where things are going back and forth. So as I mentioned, we're getting domesticated animals coming over from the old world: cattle, chicken, pigs, horses weren't here before then. And turkeys are actually coming from North America, and they get sent to Europe and become delicacies as well. We do have a few domesticated species. Largely dogs are kind of the main domesticated animal that we have here in North America before kind of this Columbian Exchange that we see before the colonial period. So there's a lot more domesticated animals in Europe and the old world than here. So, animals used for food, of course, but we also see they make some pretty great tools. And you can do, if you're, especially during pre-contact times, you can't go to the grocery store, right? You can't go to the hardware store to get things. You have to figure out how to use basically what's in Florida, what's available in the natural world. So they would use many parts of the animal that I wouldn't have thought to use, right? So we see a lot of bones being carved into tools of various types, fish hooks and pins and needles and perforators, using the antlers, as I mentioned, for hammers. And then, of course, a lot of the softer parts of the animals too, deer skins and hides were important for making leather and furs. Different tendons could be used for essentially like thread or string. And those are often harder to find, those soft organic materials. They don't last as long as bone does. Bone is full of calcium, so it's able to survive a lot longer, especially in Florida soils where it's really acidic. So in the pre-contact, the shellmans are great because all those shells are essentially made out of calcium too, right? So as they start to break down, they leach that calcium, and so everything else in the environment around it is kind of protected from those acidic soils, and so those items can last a lot longer as well. A couple of cool examples of some historic artifacts from downtown St. Augustine. Bone buttons, of course, are pretty common, especially in St. Augustine. They were living on the frontier, and they were often dependent on shipments from Central America, from the Caribbean, from Hispaniola, and coming through from Spain. And if the boats didn't show up, then they had to figure out how to make do. So we see a lot of use, once again, of figuring out what they had in Florida. So bone buttons become quite common. We also see things like fork handles and knife handles, toothbrushes, things like that are made out of bone. And so those are really cool to find as well. And then art, bone is, once again, I say a hardier material that can last a little bit longer. And so we find some really cool artwork that has been carved into bones, pendants. We find a lot of pins, bone pins. And there's a lot of speculation as to what some of those could have been used for, maybe like hairpins for tying your hair up, or for holding clothing. And we find some really pretty carved, designs in those. Sometimes they would have taken things like red ochre, which is hematite, it's a mineral that's bright red, and rubbed it into the engravings to give it some beautiful coloring. The top left picture here is really cool. It's a long bone from a deer, I believe, and it has some really cool carvings in it. This was found at a site in Jacksonville. And it has these holes that were basically punched through the bone. Long bones are essentially hollow, right? So they punched these holes through, and we think it could be a flute. So that's pretty cool. And in fact, some of the oldest instruments that archaeologists have found in general in the world are flutes made out of bird bones. So I think maybe China has one of the oldest ones. A couple several thousand years old. So some really interesting things. I'm going to pop over. I see I had a question about which soil types are better for preserving remains. And that's an interesting question. Not acidic soil is great. Really, the best preservation you're going to find are in very specific, special kind of environments that we call anaerobic, which essentially means that there's a lack of oxygen. And without oxygen, you can't have organisms and bacteria and molds and things like that that break down organic materials and cause decomposition. If they can't survive, then the organic materials end up not breaking down. Here in Florida, where we find that is down in river bottoms. So if you think about walking around in that nice, gross, mucky mud in the bottom of the river, those are the kind of conditions. If you get something down in there that just gets coated in that nice thick mud, there's not going to be a lot of oxygen. But we see other kind of extreme environments around the world. In places like Siberia, it's the cold and the frozen that has the lack of oxygen. There's sites down like in Peru where it's just very dry and arid. Out in the Southwest the United States, we see those kinds of conditions. And so, there's a lack of oxygen there, and that's what helps the materials survive. So great question about preservation. Always important to think about that, because you can only, you can only study the materials that last, right? The muck at Wendover, yes, that was a great example. I don't know if folks are familiar with Wendover Pond. That is down in Titusville, and this is one of Florida's oldest burial sites. It was about, I think, 7,500 years old, and people were buried down in the pond muck. And so we had wonderful preservation of things like stomach contents, brains, fabric, all sorts of things that don't usually survive, especially, as I say, here in Florida with this, it doesn't take long for things to break down here in Florida. But things, those items were able to make it through 7,500 years. So very cool. So this is one of the resources that Greg mailed out to you, is just a little identification sheet. And I just wanted to spend a moment talking with you guys. As I say, kind of the first step in identifying, well, first step is to say bone or no bone. And once you have bones, is to kind of think about the animal, the type of animal that it's from. And if we think about where animals have to live, that can tell us a little bit about what their bones may look like. So for example, birds have to figure out how to stay in the air. So they usually have very light, hollow bones, right? They don't need a lot of extra weight to kind of bring them down. So they can be easy to spot. Mammals, we walk around on the earth, right? Most mammals do. So we actually have usually heavier, thicker bones. And there's some information there. We can look at teeth to figure out what kind of diet that animals have. Reptiles are a little funky, and there's a little more diversity because there's a little bit of a diversity in the type environment that reptiles live. But they can be kind of medium weight, sometimes kind of woody. Alligators are really easy you can identify the scutes from those. And turtles are interesting because the carapace, the shell of the turtle, is actually part of the skeletal system. So you'll find that, and so those can be pretty easy to identify. And then there's fish, and I like to say, if it's something weird, it's probably a fish, because fish live in a pretty weird environment. In water, there's not as much of a sense of gravity and up and down and right and left. They kind of live in a more three-dimensional space. And one of the really identifiable elements of fish are actually these things called otoliths. And these are found inside their ear, and they basically help the fish figure out, what is up, what is down, which way do I maneuver. And so they're quite large compared to, the fish. Humans actually have otoliths. So we have, they call them ear crystals. And if anyone's ever had vertigo, one of the causes of vertigo is that your ear crystals get all out of whack. out of alignment. But those are essentially otoliths. So once again, fish have the same kind of infrastructure, but they're much bigger comparatively because they really rely on them a little more than we do. And they can be very distinctive depending on the type of fish. So whereas things like vertebrae, you know, fish vertebrae, they kind of look a lot alike. You know, they can look a lot alike, but the otoliths can be a little more distinctive. And those are often things, you know, if they're in the head, you know, a lot of times if you just chop a fish head and throw it away, you know, you're often to kind of find those a little more intact, and they're so thick and they can last a lot longer in the ground. So so that is the presentation I have for you. So I'll just, you know, give a plug for our social media. We are trying to put out more resources, you know, that we have and highlight them on Facebook, and we're creating some videos and some fun things to do and to interact with while we're in this. So I think I'm going to highlight the 2 activities, and then we can take questions. But if you have a question, you can go ahead and type those in. The first activity, you can try your hand. You can take a look at some of these otoliths that the fish have, and they're really cool because the otoliths grow like tree rings. So they have these distinctive lines. You know, there's seasons where the fish put on a lot of size and they get bigger, and then they kind of go dormant for a little while. So you can see some of those growth patterns. So this can tell us a lot about environment. It can tell us how old the fish is. You know, we can think about seasonality. When are people harvesting these resources? Things like that. So this is a really cool website from NOAA Fisheries. And so you can actually go on and try to count the rings and figure out how old the fish is. And there's several different species, so you can try your hands at a couple of different types of fish, and some are a lot easier to count than others. So that may keep you entertained for quite a while trying to figure that out. And then the second resource I want to highlight is actually put out by the National Park Service. Their Cane River National Historic Park has a really cool lesson plan that's on archaeology and animal bones, and it's featuring faunal assemblage from the Cane River site. And there's a couple of things you can download. There's the student handbook and the activity sheet, and so you can take a look at this, and it really gets into looking at the different types of species, looking at the minimum number of individual species that were at the site, and thinking about diet and implications. You know, it's not just to say somebody ate a lot of deer. You know, there's a lot more behind the fact that they had deer, right? So how did they acquire the deer? How did they process the deer? Who was hunting the deer? What kind of tools are they using to get the deer? Thinking about fishermen, right? Are they getting offshore fish? Are they getting inshore fish? Are they going for marine resources? Are they going for riverine resources, right? So there's a lot more that goes behind, you know, a lot of implications that goes behind even just figuring out what kinds of food people are eating. So this really kind of dives into some of those ideas, talks a little bit about, you know, how we do some of this work, and then the activity gives you a couple of some good math skills to figure out some of those minimum number of individuals and the number of identified specimens and biomass and things like that. So some great things. This is, as I say, we usually, during these resource workshops, we usually have some hands-on activities. So that's the best I can do for you here virtually, but I hope you guys get a chance to take a look at those and learn a little bit more.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much, Emily Jane, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Before you leave, real quickly, I would ask in the chat box, just for our records at the museum, if you would please send me a chat message and just tell me how many people were in your group today. Let me know how many people you had viewing the presentation with you today so that we can keep track of what we had in actual attendance here today. And as always, I've actually shared my screen here. I've got the museum's website up on my screen, and I would ask you to go to this far right tab that says support the museum, and then there's the first tab at the top says give your support now, and that's a way that you can drop a donation in our donation box at the museum without actually visiting. And of course, we need your support today, just as we do on any day there at the museum. So we want to thank you all for joining us here today. Please keep an eye on our museum Facebook page and our museum website and our newsletter as we make other announcements about different programming that we'll be hosting, and hopefully we'll see Emily Jane, if not in person. I think we already have another Archaeology Works on schedule, and I believe it's for the month of June, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I believe it is.
Yeah, we're gonna take a look at some shipwrecks, archaeology of shipwrecks.
Right. June is shipwrecks. That's going to be actually a lot of fun. I'll make sure I get some information put together on that and we get it shared with everybody. Who knows? We might be able to get together in person then and just keep our distance. Or we might be meeting again virtually. But regardless, we'll be really excited to get together with all of you again soon here at the New Smyrna Museum of History, and excited to see Emily Jane and our friends from the Florida Public Archaeology Network again real soon. So thanks for joining us today, everybody, and we'll look forward to see you soon.